Welcome back, my friend. Let everything slow. There is a grave in Darkroot Garden. Not simply a burial site, a specific location that the game had been pointing toward since the earliest areas of Dark Souls, whose name the Undead Asylum's cell blocks did not explain, but whose meaning accumulates across everything that follows. The grave of Artorias the Abysswalker, Knight of Gwyn, one of the 4 legendary warriors whose specific capabilities had made the Age of Fire possible, and whose specific fates had, each in their own way, documented what the Age of Fire eventually cost. The grave is guarded by Sif, the great grey wolf, enormous, moving with the specific reluctance of something that does not want to fight, but has been here long enough to know that everyone who reaches this place is going to try. Carries Artorias' great shield in her mouth, not as a weapon, as the specific object that connects her to the person whose grave she guards. She's been here since Artorias died. She will be here until she dies. The guarding is not a function she performs for an institution. It is the specific expression of what she is. Tonight we begin before the grave, before the abyss consumed Oolacile, before Manus rose and the darkness spread, and Artorias made the specific choice that the legend would both remember and distort. We begin with who Artorias was, the specific person whose fall produced the legend, whose legend produced the Abyss Watchers of Dark Souls 3, whose grave in Darkroot Garden was the specific destination that Sif had been protecting since before the chosen undead was born. The Four Knights of Gwyn. Lord Gwyn commanded 4 knights who were the specific instruments of his authority's most demanding requirements. Not simply soldiers, beings of exceptional individual capability, each chosen for qualities that made them suited for functions that ordinary warriors could not perform. Ornstein the Dragon Slayer, the Golden Lion Knight, whose specific gift was the hunting of the ancient dragons, the beings that the Age of Fire had supplanted, whose continued existence was the specific threat to Gwyn's dominion that required a hunter, rather than simply an army. Ornstein fought the dragons that survived the war with the ability of someone who had been doing this for longer than most things had existed and who was very good at it. Ciaran the Lord's Blade, the assassin, the specific capability that a king requires when the problem cannot be addressed through direct confrontation, when the solution requires someone who could reach what an army could not. She carried gold and dark silver tracers that were among the most precise weapons in Gwyn's arsenal, and she deployed them with the specific discretion that the Lord's Blade designation implied. She had a personal relationship with Artorias. The lore preserves this through the hornet ring she leaves at his grave, through the specific grief that her items express. Hawkeye Golf, the archer, the giant, specific gift was vision, at distances that made conventional archery irrelevant. Golf could hit a drake in flight from a position that most archers could not even identify as a firing position. He was eventually blinded. The lore does not specify whether by accident or design, and was stationed at a tower in Oolacile's area, where he continued to be useful through the specific way that a person who has been exceptional at something for a very long time continues to be useful even after the primary capability is lost. And Artorias, the Abysswalker, the knight whose specific gift was something that the others did not share. Not the hunting of external enemies, not the precision of assassination, not the vision of the archer. Artorias could walk through the abyss. He had an unbendable will of steel and an ability to traverse the darkness that consumed others without being consumed himself. He had made a covenant with the creatures of the abyss, a specific arrangement that allowed him to move through what destroyed everyone else. What the abyss was. The abyss is Dark Souls' most fundamental threat and its most carefully maintained mystery. Not a place exactly, or rather a place that is also something else, a condition that is also a location, the specific expression of what the Dark Soul is when it is unconstrained. The four great beings who had claimed the first flame at the Age of Fire's beginning had each received the Lord Soul, the specific divine substance that made them what they were. Gwyn received the Lord Soul of Light. Nito received the Lord Soul of Death. The Witch of Izalith received the Soul of Life. And the furtive pygmy, the ignored, forgotten fourth, received the Dark Soul. The specific soul that was different from the others, not light or death or life but dark, the specific quality of humanity itself in concentrated form. Humanity is the Dark Soul's expression in the material world. When a human dies and their humanity returns to the cycle, when a being accumulates too much of the Dark Soul's substance, when the specific constraints that the Age of Fire had placed on the Dark Soul's expression were removed or violated, the abyss emerged, not as a conventional physical darkness, but as the specific presence of the unconstrained Dark Soul flooding a space. New Lundo, the city that had been flooded to contain the Dark Wraiths, the specific warriors who had learned to steal humanity from others through the life drain technique that Kati had taught them, whose king had surrendered New Londo's kings to the abyss in exchange for the power Kati had offered. The abyss had emerged in New Londo when the four kings had accepted this arrangement, and the city had been flooded to contain the spread. Artorias had fought the Dark Wraiths at New Londo. This is documented in the specific descriptions of his weapons. The greatsword of Artorias struck harder against Dark Servants because Artorias had hunted them, had made fighting the servants of the abyss the specific vocation that his coat of arms with the creatures of the abyss had enabled. He knew the abyss. He had been fighting it before Oolacile, before the most famous and most devastating chapter of his career, in the flooded city whose darkness he could traverse because of the specific pact he had made. The covenant with the beasts of the abyss, the ring that allowed Artorias to traverse the abyss, the covenant of Artorias, the wolf ring, whose description states that it symbolizes his covenant with the beasts of the abyss, is one of the law's most significant ambiguities. The ring's description does not specify which beasts. The lore analysis that the community has produced suggests that it was either Frant or Kati, the two primordial serpents who each claimed to serve Gwyn's will while pursuing agendas that were not fully aligned with what they claimed. Kati was the serpent who had convinced New Londo's kings to surrender themselves to the abyss, who would later convince the chosen undead to link the Dark Soul to the flame, rather than perpetuating the Age of Fire, whose specific agenda was the propagation of humanity by any means, including the means that created the Dark Wraiths and flooded New Londo. If Kati had granted Artorias the ability to walk the abyss, had been the specific beast whose covenant had made Artorias the Abysswalker, then the knight who spent his career fighting the servants of the abyss had been enabled to do so by one of the Abyss's most significant agents. This is the specific irony that the law sustains. Artorias fighting Kate's servants, while having received his most defining capability through a pact with Kate. Whether Artorias knew this, whether the knight's unbendable will included the knowledge of exactly whose covenant he carried, is one of the ambiguities the game does not resolve. The Silver Pendant and what it protected. Before going to Oolacile, Artorias was given the Silver Pendant, an ancient treasure of Anna Londo, a specific artifact that deflected the dark of the Abyss, especially in its magic forms. The specific protection that Gwyn had provided for the knight he was sending into the most concentrated expression of the Abyss the lands had seen. It was stolen from him. This is the specific detail that the lore preserves about why Artorias failed at Oolacile. Not that he was insufficiently powerful, not that Manus exceeded his capability in a straightforward martial sense. The people of Oolacile, who had been transformed by the Abyss's influence, and who were no longer acting in ways that served their own survival, had taken the Silver Pendant from Artorias and hidden it behind an illusory wall. Artorias of the Abyss is the one story in Dark Souls where the hero loses not because he was outmatched, but because the protection he had been given was removed by the specific madness the Abyss had produced in the people around him. He went to Oolacile with the means to survive what he faced. The means were taken. He faced what he faced without them. His relationship with Sif, Great Grey Wolf Sif, the companion who would survive Oolacile's fall and guard Artorias' grave for the centuries between the DLC's events and the main game. She is already fully grown in the main game encounter, enormous, grey, moving with the specific grace of a wolf who has been here for a very long time. She had been young when they went to Oolacile. Not a puppy exactly. The lore does not establish her precise age at the time, but young enough that the encounter with her in the DLC's past period, the summoning available in the fight against Manus, shows a smaller Sif than the one in Darkroot Garden, a wolf who was still growing into what she would become. Artorias and Sif had fought together. This is the specific context that their relationship was built in. Not simply ownership, not the conventional relationship of a knight and a war dog, but the specific kinship of two beings who had been in the Abyss together, who had faced what New Londo had held and survived it together. The wolf ring's name, the symbol of the covenant, was not named for the primordial serpents or for the Abyss's creatures in the abstract. It was named for the wolf that had been beside Artorias in every dark place he had entered. When Artorias made his final choice in Oolacile, when his left arm was broken and Manus had defeated him and he could no longer fight, the specific act he performed was protecting Sif. He used his great shield to form a barrier around her, not around himself, not to attempt to survive long enough to be rescued. Around Sif, she survived. He did not, in the sense that mattered. The specific choice, using the last of his capability to protect his companion, rather than to continue the fight or to survive, is what produced the grave in Darkroot Garden that she would guard for centuries. Sleep well. 7 more parts remain, and Oolacile is still above the earth. Oolacile, a kingdom of sorcery, the specific tradition of sorcery that predated the Vinheim Dragon School. that worked with light in ways that the Dragon School's stone-based sorcery did not, that had its own relationship to the specific magical inheritance of the age before the first flame had transformed the world, a prosperous place, a beautiful place, the kind of place whose specific character was defined by the particular gift it had developed, rather than by conflict or conquest. Princess Dusk of Oolacile, the ruler, or the heir, the specific figure, whose presence the sorcerers of Oolacile had organized their protective attention around, who embodied the kingdom's specific relationship to the magical tradition that had made Oolacile what it was. She appears in the main game as an NPC in Darkroot Basin, a golden phantom figure in an unusual summoning sphere, trapped there by the crystal golem that had been carrying the sphere, requiring rescue before she can speak to the chosen undead and provide the access to the DLC that follows. When she speaks of Manus, when she recounts the experience of being held by the creature from the abyss, she says something that the game treats as more significant than it initially appears. She could sense its emotions, a wrenching nostalgia, a lost joy, an object of obsession, a sincere hope to reclaim something lost. She is asking whether Manus is actually a beast, whether the creature from the abyss that consumed Oolacile had not simply been a monster, but something that had been a person, that carried the specific interior life of someone who had lost something precious and could not stop searching for it. This is the question that the entire Oolacile DLC was organized around answering. What was Manus? What had Oolacile done? And why had a primordial human's grief been able to swallow an entire kingdom? What Oolacile was. Oolacile's specific sorcery tradition was based in the manipulation of light, the Oolacile Ivory Catalyst, the Oolacile Sorcery Set, the specific spells that the DLC's sorcery teacher Elizabeth and the trapped Chester carried. All of them expressed a different relationship to magical power than the stone tablets of Seath's Dragon School or the faith miracles of Gwyn's church. They worked with humanity in a different way as well. The specific relationship that Oolacile's tradition had to the Dark Soul's material, to the humanity that was Dark Soul's expression in living beings, was not as careful as the traditions that had developed alongside the Age of Fire's suppression of the Dark Soul's full expression. Oolacile's sorcerers understood something about humanity that made them willing to dig. Not in the abstract, specifically. They heard from a serpent that something lay buried beneath their land, something ancient, something whose power could be accessed if they could reach it. The serpent, almost certainly Kay, the primordial serpent who had encouraged New Londo's kings to surrender to the abyss, who had been working toward the propagation of humanity by whatever means were available. The Dark Souls narrative repeats this pattern. Carthy appearing to parties who had access to what he needed, offering them a version of the truth about what they could gain from listening to him, not mentioning the specific cost of what he was suggesting. He told Oolacile's sorcerers about Manus, about what lay beneath their land, about what could be accessed if they were willing to excavate the grave where it rested. He did not tell them what would happen when they dug it up, or he did not tell them in a way that made the cost comprehensible before it was too late. They dug, they found the grave, they disturbed what was in it. Who Manus had been, Manus was once human. This is the specific statement that the game makes through the item descriptions. associated with him and with the DLC's events. Not a god, not an ancient creature that had always been the darkness. A person. A primordial human, in the specific sense of someone from the earliest period of human existence. From the time before the Age of Fire had fully organized the world around the first flames categories, he was the first human, or one of the first. The specific designation of primordial human suggests someone from the generation of the furtive pygmy from the time when the dark soul was newly distributed into human existence, rather than having been present across countless generations. He had been buried. The sorcerers of Oolacile were told he was there and dug him up. They hoped to unlock his dark power, the specific force that a primordial human who carried more of the original dark soul than the diluted inheritance of later generations would have contained. They wanted what that power could do for them. They were willing to disturb a grave for it. What happened when they disturbed it? Manus woke, not as the person who had been buried, not as the human who had lived and died in the earliest period of the world's history, and been interred with whatever specific rites of that era had accompanied his burial, the disturbance of his grave, and the specific pain of what the sorcerers had done to him in attempting to extract his dark power, had caused his humanity to go wild, going wild. This is the specific term for what happens when the dark soul's material, accumulated in a single being beyond the threshold that the human form can contain, overflows without the specific control that makes it a resource rather than a flood. Manus's humanity did not simply activate, it erupted. The specific concentrated essence of a primordial human's dark soul, disturbed from centuries of burial and tortured by the sorcerers who had dug him up, expanded into the world around him as the abyss. He was no longer a person, or he was a person in the specific sense that Dusk had sensed, still carrying the nostalgia, the lost joy, the obsession, the hope, but in a form that could not contain what it was, or direct it with the specificity that personhood requires. The object of obsession, what Manus eternally sought, what his humanity, gone wild, was searching for even in the specific form of a creature that could not remember in the way a person remembers, was the broken pendant, the specific artifact that the chosen undead finds in the main game, in the area of Darkroot Basin that connects to the DLC. What was the broken pendant? The lore does not say explicitly. It was his. It was precious. It was the specific object around which the lost joy and the wrenching nostalgia were organized. The material expression of what had been lost, whether it had been a gift, a relic, an heirloom, the last physical connection to something or someone that had mattered to him in his human life. The game does not specify. It was simply his, and it was gone, and the search for it had not stopped across whatever centuries he had lain in the grave and the period of the abyss's eruption. He pulled the chosen undead through time. This is the specific mechanism of the DLC's access. Manus, sensing the broken pendant's presence in the chosen undead's inventory, acquired from a crystal golem in Darkroot Basin, reached forward through time and pulled the person carrying his precious object back to the period of Oolacile's fall, not a deliberate attack. The specific automatic reaching of a being organized around finding what it had lost, what the abyss did to Oolacile. The abyss that erupted from Manus's disturbed grave spread across Oolacile, not quickly. The specific spread of the abyss through a kingdom had the character of something organic rather than instantaneous. The darkness advancing through the landscape at a pace that made it simultaneously possible to observe and impossible to outrun. What the abyss did to Oolacile's inhabitants was not simply death. It corrupted them, transformed them from the sorcerers and citizens they had been into the specific darkness-infused creatures that the DLC's environment was populated with. The townspeople of Oolacile Township, visible throughout the DLC's central area, were what Oolacile's people had become after the abyss had taken hold. They were hostile. They were not simply wild. They retained something of their human form, moved with the specific patterns of people who had been doing human things before the darkness changed them. But the abyss had claimed what had made them people, and what remained was the specific hollow hostility of beings whose interior life had been replaced by the darkness that had consumed it. Princess Dusk was taken. A shadow beast, one of the abyss's creatures, the specific form of darkness given agency, captured her and brought her into the depths. She was the person Artorias had been sent to rescue, the person who would eventually be found by the chosen undead in a summoning sphere in Darkroot Basin, who would speak of sensing Manus's emotions, who would provide the access to the DLC's events. She had been there while all of it happened, captured before the worst had occurred, unable to observe the full extent of the fall. She had experienced the abyss from within its depths rather than watching it advance across the surface. What she had sensed, the nostalgia, the lost joy, was what she had perceived from inside the creature whose darkness had taken her. Carthy's role, the primordial serpent, who had likely told Oolacile's sorcerers about Manus, who had been, in the centuries before the DLC's events, working toward the propagation of humanity through whatever means were available, who had convinced the four kings of New Londo to surrender themselves to the abyss, who would, centuries later, convince the chosen undead to link the dark flame. Whether Cartha had anticipated the specific scale of what would happen when Oolacile's sorcerers disturbed Manus's grave is one of the questions the lore does not answer. He had always worked toward the dark's propagation, toward the conditions in which the Age of Dark that he believed should follow the Age of Fire could occur. The abyss erupting from Manus's disturbed grave was not what Carthy had claimed he was offering when he told Oolacile's sorcerers about what lay beneath their land. Or it was exactly what he intended. The darkness that consumed Oolacile spread further than the kingdom's borders in its consequences. It required Gwyn to dispatch his finest knight. It produced the specific crisis that the DLC documents. It provided the conditions in which the abyss's nature was demonstrated in a way that changed how the world related to it. Cathy wanted the abyss to propagate. He used the truth of Manus's existence to get Oolacile's sorcerers to do what would propagate it, whether he knew what would happen to them, whether the specific harm to Oolacile was a regrettable side effect, or an acceptable cost, or a deliberate instrument, is the question that his character throughout the entire Dark Souls narrative sustains without resolving. He said he was serving the cause of humanity. The abyss he helped unleash consumed humanity in Oolacile. Both things are true. The game trusts the player to notice. Elizabeth and the Mushroom Grove, among those who had not been fully claimed by the abyss. Elizabeth occupied the most unusual position in Oolacile's final days. The Mushroom Woman the ancient being who had been living in the area for longer than most of Oolacile's recorded history, who described herself as the Guardian of Dusk, remained in the Oolacile sanctuary while the darkness advanced around it. She was not transformed by the abyss in the way that Oolacile's human inhabitants were transformed. Whether this was because her nature, whatever she was, something between plant and person, one of the specific organic beings that Dark Souls populates its most ancient spaces with, was resistant to the Dark's specific claim on humanity, or because she had been present long enough to have some specific protection from the darkness she had always lived near. The game does not say. She watched Oolacile fall. She was still there when the chosen undead arrived. Centuries after the fall, in the past, in the specific moment the DLC placed the player in, she knew about Artorias. She was the one who warned the chosen undead. An abyss was begat of the ancient beast, and threatens to swallow the whole of Oolacile. Knight Artorias came to stop this, but such a hero has nary a murmur of dark. Without doubt he will be swallowed by the abyss, overcome by its utter blackness. She knew he would fail before he had failed. She knew the abyss would swallow him before it had, whether she tried to warn him. Whether Artorias arrived in Oolacile with Elizabeth's specific assessment of his chances and chose to proceed anyway is not documented. What is documented is that she was still present, still in the sanctuary, still aware of everything that was happening, and that when the chosen undead arrived, she had the specific knowledge of where to send them and what to expect. Sleep well. 6 more parts remain, and Artorias is already descending. Artorias arrived in Oolacile, knowing what he was walking into. He had fought the abyss at New Londo. He had the covenant that allowed him to traverse the darkness without being consumed by it. He had the Silver Pendant that deflected the abyss's magic in its most direct form. He had Sif beside him. He was the most qualified person in Gwyn's court for this specific mission. Possibly the most qualified person in the world. Elizabeth knew he would fail. She knew because she understood the specific nature of what Manus was. Not a conventional abyss creature, not the dark wraiths who had fought at New Londo, not the kind of darkness that Artorias' covenant and his Silver Pendant had been designed to address. Manus was the abyss's source, not its product, and the specific quality of a being who was nary a murmur of dark, who had made his covenant with the creatures of the abyss, but who was himself fundamentally a creature of light, was that he could not withstand what the source of darkness itself could bring to bear. Tonight we follow what happened, not the legend, the event, the specific sequence by which one of the most capable knights in the Age of Fire's history lost to what he had been sent to stop, and what his loss produced, the theft of the Silver Pendant. The people of Oolacile, who had been transformed by the abyss, were not simply mindless. They retained enough of what they had been to perform specific actions, to take things, to hide things, to do the specific work that madness directed by darkness could accomplish. They took the Silver Pendant, the ancient treasure of Anor Londo, the specific protection that Gwyn had given Artorias before sending him to Oolacile, the deflection of the dark in its magic forms that was the most immediate practical counter to Manus's sorcery, was hidden behind an illusory wall in the area around Oolacile, whether this was directed by Manus himself. whether the Abyss's father had enough awareness of the threat that Artorias represented to direct the corrupted citizens toward removing his protection, or whether it was the specific opportunism of beings that the darkness had made hostile to everything outside it. The outcome was the same. Artorias entered the deepest conflict of the Oolacile crisis without the specific defense that had been designed for it. This is the specific element of the story that makes Artorias' failure not a failure of character or capability. He had the will, he had the covenant, he had the skill. What he did not have, what had been taken from him by the very darkness he had come to fight, was the protection against the one aspect of the darkness he could not simply walk through on his own. Facing Manus, Artorias and Sif descended into the chasm of the abyss, the specific location where Manus's presence was most concentrated. The depth below Oolacile township, where the darkness had its origin, where the disturbed grave had been, and where the being that had erupted from it was most fully present. The chasm of the abyss is one of Dark Soul's most affecting environments. Not because of its visual complexity, it is relatively sparse. Because of what inhabits it, the humanity sprites, floating, glowing fragments of humanity, drawn toward the darkness that Manus represented, orbiting the specific presence of the Father of the Abyss in the way that the Dark Soul's material is drawn toward its source. These are souls, fragments of the Dark Soul, the humanity that made beings alive in the specific way that distinguished persons from the mere bodies those persons inhabited, drawn into the chasm, circling Manus in the specific helpless way of something that has been pulled toward a gravity it cannot resist. Artorias and Sif fought Manus, the specific details of the fight, the sequence of the confrontation, what tactics Artorias employed, how long the fight lasted, are not documented in the lore. What is documented is the outcome. Artorias' left arm was broken. Manus had beaten him, the Abysswalker, who had fought the dark wraiths of New Londo, who had faced the abyss in its contained form, could not defeat the abyss's source. Without the Silver Pendant to deflect the specific dark sorceries that Manus commanded at his most powerful, the dark bead barrages, the darkness that rained from the sky in multiple simultaneous manifestations, Artorias was fighting something that his covenant alone could not protect him from. The covenant let him walk in the abyss. It did not make him immune to what the abyss's father could do. The last act, his left arm was broken, the specific wound that all depictions of Artorias preserve, the arm that hangs at his side, that he cannot lift, that has been hanging since this moment and will hang until the chosen undead ends his suffering in the Colosseum, was the immediate physical consequence of what Manus had done to him. He was going to be consumed. The abyss that he had been able to walk through because of his covenant was going to claim him fully, in the way that Elizabeth had predicted it would. Overcome by its utter blackness, swallowed by the dark, he used his great shield to form a barrier around Sif. The cleansing great shield, Artorias' signature defensive weapon, deeply scarred by the abyss, its magic defense high because of the specific properties of what it had been exposed to. The shield that represented the defensive aspect of a knight who was known for his offensive capability was used in this final moment, not to protect himself. The item description preserves this. Artorias, deeply scarred by the abyss, used this to form a barrier to protect his compatriot Sif. Although this drained the shield, Its magic defense remains high, drained, not simply used. The specific power of the Great Shield was consumed in forming the barrier. Whatever protective capability it had retained after Artorias' contact with the Abyss was spent on keeping Sif safe. Sif survived within the barrier, protected by the shield that had been drained to protect her. The great grey wolf, who had descended into the Abyss with Artorias, was kept from the specific corruption that had claimed everything else in the chasm. She was young. She was there. She was the one thing Artorias managed to save. And then the Abyss took him. What corruption looks like. The Artorias that the chosen undead encounters in the Colosseum. The boss fight that constitutes the first major encounter of the DLC is not a villain. This is the specific distinction that the game builds its characterization around. He is not an antagonist who has made a choice. He is a person who has been consumed by something that removed the capacity for choice. His armor is tattered, the armor set associated with him. The Wolf Knight set in Dark Souls 3's designation is described in the later game as the armor of a knight tainted by the dark of the Abyss, and the twilight blue tassel described as damp and will ever remain so. The specific aesthetic of someone who went into the water and never came back dry, whose contact with the Abyss had left something permanent on everything they wore. He fights with one arm, the left arm hangs. Every attack is performed with the right arm, with the great sword whose power the Abyss had tainted in the specific one-armed style that the broken arm imposed on every movement. The movements are wild, frenzied, not the controlled precision that a knight of Artorias' skill would have expressed in an uncorrupted state. The specific transformation of exceptional capability into exceptional ferocity without the governance that skill requires. He is not simply fighting hard. He has been replaced by the Abyss's expression of what he was. He speaks. Before the fight there is a moment. The specific moment that the Abyss has not fully claimed, that the person inside the corruption briefly resurfaces, where the words that emerge from the corruption are not simply a battle cry. Whatever thou art, stay away. Soon I will be consumed by them by the dark. Thou art strong human. Surely thine kind are more than pure dark. I beg of thee, the spread of the Abyss must be stopped. Ah, Sif, all of you, forgive me, for I have availed you nothing. This is Artorias. Briefly, in the specific moment before the corruption fully reclaims him for the fight, acknowledging that he has failed, asking the person he is about to try to kill to stop what he could not stop, ending with the name of the wolf he had protected, and the specific apology of someone whose attempt to help had produced nothing except the continuation of his suffering. Forgive me, for I have availed you nothing. He is not asking to be saved. He is asking to be stopped. The chosen undead who fights him, who defeats him in the Colosseum, preserves his honor in the specific way that the item description acknowledges. The legend that Artorias repelled the Abyss only told half the story. It seems that he was defeated and his honor preserved by some unsung hero who is the true victor over the Abyss. Sif in the chasm, the great wolf who survived. In the past period that the DLC depicts, she is available as a summon in the fight against Manus. The young Sif, smaller than the one in Darkroot Garden, summoned into the chasm of the Abyss to fight the being whose eruption had produced all of this. She fights, not with the specific grief that she brings to the Darkroot Garden encounter, in the main game. She has not yet been guarding the grave. She has not yet had centuries to process what she lost. She fights because her companion is consumed by what she is fighting, because the thing in the chasm is the thing that took him, because she is the wolf who had descended with him and whose companion the barrier had saved. The summon sign is inside Manus's arena, not before the fight, within it. She can only enter the fight after it has begun. When the player reaches the specific moment in the encounter that makes summoning possible, she is present in the specific way of someone who had been there for the original confrontation and who is available to the chosen undead who comes after. A resource, a companion, a piece of the story that the fight invites you to continue. After Manus is defeated, she is gone. The past resolves. The chosen undead returns to the main game's present, and Sif is in Darkroot Garden, as she has always been, guarding the grave of the person she went into the abyss with and could not save from what was in it. Sleep well. 5 more parts remain, and the chosen undead is arriving at the Colosseum. Welcome back. Let everything slow. The chosen undead arrived in Oolacile's past, not through a door or a portal chosen freely, through a compulsion. Manus reaching forward through time, sensing the broken pendant that had been carried in the chosen undead's inventory, pulling the person who carried his precious object back through the centuries to where he was. The arrival in Oolacile was not a decision the player made. It was what Manus did when the pendant came close enough. This specific mechanism, the father of the abyss, pulling someone from the future through time to reach the object he had catching, is one of he had been searching for, is one of the stranger pieces of Dark Souls time-related lore. The game establishes early that time flows in mysterious ways in the world, often of Dark Souls, rarely running as the conventional sequence of past, present, future implies. The chosen undead going to Oolacile's past was not a violation of the rules of the setting. It was the specific way the rules functioned in this situation. Tonight, we follow the chosen undead's path through Oolacile, not simply as a sequence of areas and enemies, but as the specific narrative that the DLC's geography was organized around. The Royal Wood, the first area of the Oolacile DLC, a forest space, the specific space, the specific quality of a place that had been before the abyss advanced, the royal grounds of the kingdom, whose people were now the darkness-corrupted creatures that populated the area, the Guardians, the specific enemies of the Royal Wood that were not simply transformed citizens, but the specific remnants of the protective tradition that the royal grounds had maintained. They'd had been guardians before the abyss. Their function was to protect the royal space from intrusion. The darkness had transformed them without eliminating the specific orientation toward protection and territorial hostility that had organized their existence. This is the particular quality that the Oolacile DLC's enemy communicates throughout. The corruption had not replaced what the inhabitants were with something generic. It had taken what they were and expressed it through darkness. The Guardians were still guarding, in the specific hostile way of things that had been changed by what they were originally oriented toward protecting. The Colosseum at the end of the Royal Wood, the space where Artorias was encountered. See, the architecture is specific, not a conventional boss arena, but a formal tournament space. The kind of enclosed area where champions were displayed and contested in a tradition that had meaning before the darkness had made all contexts the same context. Artorias was not waiting in the Colosseum in the simple senses of an enemy occupying a space. He was there in the specific way of someone who had been fighting, who had been doing the specific work of attempting to push back the darkness, even in his corrupted state, who had been engaging the creatures of the Oolacile area, with the abyss driving him toward what his mission had been before the abyss had taken his mind. The item descriptions note that even in his corrupted state, he hadn't wholly forgotten his mission. The corruption had not replaced the purpose. It had twisted the specific expression of the purpose, the frenzied movements, the wild attacks. The one-armed fighting was being used by some of a knight that was not him. Body was being used by something doing what he had been trying to do. He was still fighting. The abyss was fighting through him. The fight, the chosen undead who reached the Colosseum and entered the fog, encountered the specific expression of what Artorias had become and the specific moment of awareness that interrupted the corruption's control. Whatever thou art, stay away. The brief resurfacing of the person inside the abyss's expression of him. Then the fight, the specific reason that the chosen undead could do what Artorias could not against Manus, could survive the abyss's direct engagement without being consumed, was the humanity that Dusk and Elizabeth both referenced. Human. Thine kind are more than pure dark, the chosen undead, who had been hollowing and reanimating and accumulating humanity across the entire main game, carried the dark soul's material in a way that the knight Artorias did not. Artorias had made a covenant with the abyss's creatures to traverse the darkness. He could walk where others could not, but his fundamental nature, Knight of Gwyn, servant of the Age of Fire, a being whose specific qualities were light rather than dark, meant that direct confrontation with the Father of the Abyss left him without the specific resource that protected against being consumed. The chosen undead was human. The dark soul was their inheritance, not as knights or servants of the gods, but as the specific descendants of the furtive pygmy, whose dark soul had been distributed into humanity from the beginning. They could bear what the abyss brought, because the abyss was, in a specific sense, theirs. When the chosen undead defeated Artorias in the Colosseum, when the fight ended and the knight's corrupted form was stilled. The specific honor that the legend attributed to Artorias was preserved by the action of the person who had just killed him, not by Artorias himself. By the unsung hero whose name history would not remember. The source's description says it clearly. The legend that Artorias repelled the abyss only told half the story. The world remembered Artorias as the one who had stopped the darkness. The truth was that he had been defeated and someone else had done what he could not. Oolacile Township, the DLC's central area, the actual settlement of Oolacile, specifically where the kingdom's citizens had lived and worked and practiced the light sorcery that had made Oolacile what it was. After the abyss, the transformed inhabitants were everywhere, not warriors, the specific shapes of what sorcerers and scholars and ordinary citizens had become when the darkness had taken their humanity's wild overflow and expressed it through their bodies. They were hostile in the specific way of beings that had lost the capacity for the kind of recognition that allows cooperation, whose entire orientation toward the world outside them had been reduced to the specific threat response that the darkness had left behind, the chained prisoner, the entity in the cage that the chosen undead could find in Oolacile Township, shackled, enormous, its nature ambiguous, in ways that the law does not fully resolve. Not a boss, not a simple enemy, something that the kingdom had been containing before the abyss, whose containment the abyss had interrupted in the specific way that apocalyptic events interrupt all the contained things that ordinary society maintains. Chester, the enigmatic figure who appeared at various points in the DLC, a crossbow user whose specific anachronism, whose equipment and attitude were distinctly not of Oolacile's time period, whose presence in the past of the Dark Souls world had not been explained. He had come to Oolacile as the chosen undead had come, pulled there, or having found his own way through the specific temporal properties of the Dark Souls world. He knew things he should not have known. His attitude toward the chosen undead, the specific quality of someone who had seen how this was going to end and was maintaining a kind of professional distance from the emotional weight of it, was not the attitude of someone experiencing the fall of Oolacile as a discovery. He had been here, or he knew the history from his own time and had arrived to observe it rather than to address it. The DLC does not fully explain Chester. He remains as the specific presence of someone whose full context was withheld, whose role in the events of Oolacile was not clearly defined, whose presence served the specific narrative function of confirming that the chosen undead was not the only being capable of moving through the temporal anomalies that Dark Souls world produced. Hawkeye Goff, the Fourth Knight of Gwyn, the giant who had been blinded and stationed at a tower in the area that corresponded to what the main game called the Darkroot Garden. He was present in Oolacile's time, occupying the tower that the main game's giant blacksmith's tower corresponded to, the specific sentinel position that allowed him to monitor the area even and after the specific capability that had made him exceptional had been lost. He was no longer an archer in the functional sense. The blindness that had ended his career as the knight who could hit drakes in flight from impossible positions had reduced him to a kind of contained knowledge, a person who could advise and who could preparation and who could still apply his skill in situations that did not require sight in the conventional way. He gave the chosen undead a specific item for a specific purpose, the Hawk Ring, the ring that extended bow range, the specific capability that was Goff's gift expressed in a transferable form, and the ability to request the one specific action that a blind giant who used to be the finest archer in the world could still perform, shooting down Calamite, the black dragon who had been menacing the area, the ancient dragons that Gwyn's knights had been speech dragons had been unable to address through conventional approaches, whose specific ferocity and whose specific elevation made it to ground-based combat in the way that inaccessible to ground-based, but in the way that most enemies were accessible. Goff could still shoot a dragon in flight. He could not see it in the way that sighted archers see targets. He could hear it. He could track the specific sound of wings at the specific altitude that a dragon in flight produced. He requested only one thing from the chosen undead before taking the shot. Confirm that it was there, that the dragon was present. He would do the rest. He shot it down. A blind giant who used to be the greatest archer in the age, taking down a dragon by sound in a single shot that clipped its wing and brought it to the ground where the chosen undead could fight it directly. This is Goff's specific tragedy in the compressed form that Dark Souls tends to use for its most affecting characters. He was still what he had been in the specific ways that mattered. Even after the capability that defined him was gone, he could not see the dragon. He could still hit it. What the DLC's geography was showing, the Royal Wood led to Oolacile Township, led to the Chasm of the Abyss. This progression from the palace's forest grounds through the settlement to the source was the specific sequence that Artorias had followed when he came to Oolacile. The chosen undead was retracing his path. At each stage, what had failed Artorias was present. The Royal Wood, where the Silver Pendant had been hidden behind an illusory wall. The township, where the corrupted citizens had become the source of the corruption's spread. The Gazdom, where Manus waited. The Chosen, where undead. The chosen undead was completing what Artorias could not complete. Not improving on his approach. following the specific route that his failure had mapped, equipped with what his failure had demonstrated was necessary, bearing the specific quality of humanity that his nature had not allowed him to bring. He went first. His failure, his defeat at Manus's hands, his protection of Sif, his corruption in the Colosseum, was what made the chosen undead success possible, not simply by demonstrating what needed to be done, but by producing the specific conditions in which the chosen undead, dead, arrived. A world that knew Oolacile had fallen, that preserved the legend of the Abysswalker, that had Sif in Darkroot Garden, guarding the grave that the chosen undead would eventually need access to. The great shield that Sif carried in her mouth in the main game encounter. The drained great shield that Artorias had used to protect her was what gave the chosen undead the Covenant of Artorias ring when Sif was defeated. The ring that had allowed Artorias to traverse the abyss, passed from Artorias to Sif through the last act of his uncorrupted will, passed from Sif to the chosen undead through the specific grief of a fight that should not have happened. Sleep well. 4 more parts remain, and Manus is waiting in the depths. The chasm of the abyss, the specific endpoint of everything the DLC had been building toward. Not simply a dungeon level, the place where the abyss had its source, where Manus's disturbed grave had been, where the humanity sprites circled in the darkness around the presence of the being whose grief had consumed a kingdom. The descent into the chasm is one of Dark Souls' most atmospheric sequences, not the most demanding. The enemies that populate it are dangerous, but not the most technically complex the game offers. What makes it distinctive is the specific quality of what it is. You are descending into the dark that everything had been fighting against, into the specific space where the father of the abyss was most present, into the place where Artorias and Sif had fought, and where the young Sif was still available to summon if the chosen undead had found the sign in the arena. Tonight we sit with Manus specifically, not as a boss encounter, as a person, or the remnant of one, what he was, what was taken from him, what the specific obsession that drove him, even in his transformed state, reveals about who he had been, what Dusk sensed, the specific conversation that Princess Dusk had with the chosen undead in the main game, after being rescued from the crystal golem, before the access to the DLC, before any of the events in Oolacile was organized around the question she could not resolve by herself. She had been captured by Manus. She had been in his presence, in the chasm, in the specific proximity of the father of the abyss, for the duration of her captivity. She should have been simply terrified. Instead, she was confused. I still think on that creature from the abyss that preyed on me. My faculties were far from lucid, but I quite clearly sensed its certain emotions. A wrenching nostalgia, a lost joy, an object of obsession, a sincere hope to reclaim it. Could these thoughts belong to the beast from the abyss. But if that were true, then perhaps it is no beast after all. This is the specific question that Dusk's experience poses. The creature that had destroyed Oolacile, that had consumed her kingdom and transformed its people and driven away or consumed everything that had made the place what it was, had emotions that Dusk recognized as human, not the generic emotional states of something that destroyed for the pleasure of destruction, the specific directed emotions of someone who had lost something and wanted it back. She was asking whether Manus was a monster or a person. The answer the DLC eventually provides through the specific nature of the broken pendant, through what Manus's soul yields, through the specific description of what he had been before being disturbed, is both. He was a person who had become a monster, not through choice or through corruption of his character, through the specific violation of his rest and the overwhelming of his human form by the dark soul he had carried. The humanity sprites, the beings that circled Manus in the chasm, were not generic magical effects. They were souls. The specific fragment of dark soul material that made that human beings alive. The humanity that could be accumulated, that the dark wraiths had been stealing from humans, that gave access to the covenant against the dark, that protected against, had been drawn to Manus' presence and was orbiting him in the chasm. Why they were drawn there is explained by the specific nature of what Manus was. He was the source, the primordial human, whose dark soul had been the most direct expression of the original inheritance that the furtive pygmy had passed into humanity. The humanity sprites circling him were not random fragments of the dark soul's material. They were the dark soul's material, expressing its affinity for the source it had descended from. This is one of the law's most specifically melancholy images, the souls of the dead, or fragments of what had made them alive, orbiting the being whose existence had drawn them here, unable to return to the cycle they had been part of, kept in the specific gravitational influence of the abyss's center. The chasm of the abyss was where the dark soul wanted to be, and Manus was why. The broken pendant. What was the broken pendant? The lore does not say, and this omission is one of the most deliberately maintained mysteries in the DLC. The item description states only that it is a broken pendant belonging to someone from a previous age, and that it is perhaps connected to the will of Manus, the ancient beast of the abyss. Its specific origin, who had made it, who had given it to Manus, what it had represented to him, is left to inference. The most common reading in the lore community, it was connected to someone Manus had loved, a memorial or a token, the specific material object that carried the lost joy that Dusk had sensed. The thing whose loss was organized into the wrenching nostalgia that had not faded, lost even across the centuries of his burial. He was buried with nothing else. or nothing else that survived as a distinct object in the lore. The broken pendant was what remained of whatever life he had lived, and whatever relationships that life had contained, and whatever the specific loss was that the pendant commemorated. The chosen undead carried it, not because they knew what it was or what it meant, because it was a useful item, because it had been in a crystal golem's inventory, because the specific game mechanics of the DLC's access required the player to have it in their possession. Manus pulled the chosen undead back through time, because the pendant was close enough to sense whether he got what he wanted, whether the broken pendant being present in the arena where he fought the chosen undead provided whatever he had looking for. The fight does not address. He fought for the pendant and lost. The chosen undead kept it. The broken pendant is available in the chosen undead's inventory after the fight, a small item with a large significance that the game had been pointing toward since the moment it was picked up fighting Manus. The encounter with Manus in the chasm of the Abyss is one of Dark Souls' most technically demanding fights. Not the longest, not the most strategically complex, the most kinetically demanding. Manus moved fast, the large left arm, with the teeth inside the palm, capable of extending to reach enemies at unexpected distances. The dark sorceries in the second phase, the dark bead barrage, and the pattern that rained dark orbs from above, each one capable of significantly damaging an unprepared player. The Silver Pendant, the item that had been stolen from Artorias by Oolacile's corrupted citizens, the ancient treasure of course that deflected the darkest magic forms of the Abyss in its magic box, was findable in the DLC's area, behind the illusory wall where it had been hidden. The chosen undead could retrieve it, the item that had been taken from Artorias before his fight with Manus was accessible to the chosen undead who came after. This is the specific symmetry that the lore built around the central tragedy. Artorias had the Silver Pendant and lost it. The chosen undead could find it. The protection that had been taken from the knight was available to the person who followed him in the specific location where Oolacile's transformed inhabitants had hidden it, using the Silver Pendant correctly, deploying it at the moment when Manus launched his dark sorcery attacks, deflected what would otherwise have been devastating. The item's specific mechanic and the specific window required for effective use made it a test of attentiveness rather than simply a power boost. You had to know to boost. You had to know when to use it. You had to be watching for the specific moment. You had to apply the specific protection at the specific time. Artorias would have used it the same way. He had carried it for exactly this purpose. He had been unable to use it because it was gone. Manus's soul and what it yielded when Manus was defeated. When the father of the Abyss was still at last, he dropped his soul. The soul of Manus, the father of the Abyss, the specific material of a primordial human's dark soul concentrated into the object that the game's crafting system allowed to be used. The item description of the soul notes that it was once owned by a simple, ordinary human. The specific contrast, the father of the abyss, the being whose grief had consumed a kingdom, described as having once been a simple, ordinary human, is the DLC's most direct statement of who Manus had been before his grave was disturbed. Simple, ordinary, not a god, not a sorcerer, not a person of exceptional power or exceptional significance in the world before his burial. A person whose humanity had gone wild when disturbed, whose grief had been the specific mechanism by which an ordinary person became the father of the abyss. This is the most disturbing implication of the entire Oolacile DLC. Manus was not a special case. He was not exceptional in the way that made his transformation an aberration rather than a possibility. He was ordinary. And what had happened to him was what could happen to any ordinary human whose humanity was overwhelmed, whose dark soul was pushed past the point of containment, whose rest was disturbed by people who wanted what they thought he contained. The furtive pygmy distributed the dark soul into humanity at the Age of Fire's beginning. Every human carries some fragment of it. Every human's humanity, under the specific conditions of extremity that the Oolacile sorcerers had created by disturbing Manus's grave, could potentially do what his had done. This is what the abyss is at its most fundamental, the human inheritance, what gone wild, not an external threat, but the specific expression of what humanity was carrying unconstrained, his soul's fragments. After Manus's defeat, his soul split. The Dark Souls 2 lore, building on this moment's implications, established that the fragments of Manus's soul became several beings. The old ones of Dark Souls 2, the specific entities that Nashandra and the other bearers of Manus's soul expressed. Nashandra was the fragment of longing, the specific quality of the wrenching nostalgia that Dusk had sensed, the lost joy, the obsession, concentrated into a being that carried exactly those qualities as her defining characteristic. The specific irony of Nashandra's existence, the longing that had driven Manus, the grief for what had been lost, the hope to reclaim it, was expressed in Dark Souls 2 as a manipulative queen whose specific approach to getting what she wanted was the deception of everyone around her. The emotion that had been genuine in Manus, however monstrous its expression, became something more calculated in the fragment of his soul that became her. What was sincere in the grief was not sincere in the inheritance, the wrenching nostalgia of a person who had lost something precious became when concentrated into a separate beings. The specific quality of someone who used that longing instrumentally. The broken Pondon had been his. Whatever it had commemorated. Whoever or whatever the lost joy had been organized around was not recoverable after his defeat. The fragment The fragments that his soul produced did not carry the specific content of what he had been seeking. They carried the seeking itself, the emotional quality of the longing, without the specific object of the longing that had made the seeking meaningful. Sleep well. 3 more parts remain, and the legend is waiting to be corrected. Manus is dead. Oolacile is not saved. The kingdom had already fallen before the chosen undead arrived, and the specific sequence of events that the DLC depicts is the sequence of Oolacile's fall, not its prevention. What has been accomplished? Princess Dusk has been rescued. Manus has been stopped. The specific source of the abyss that had been spreading through the area has been addressed. But the DLC is not simply the story of stopping Manus. It is the story of Artorias, and stopping Manus was only one part of that story. The rest of it is in the people who remained after he was gone. Tonight we follow Ciaran and Sif, the 2 figures whose specific relationships to Artorias documented what his loss had meant to those who had known him. Ciaran, the Lord's Blade. She appears after Artorias' death, not in the DLC's past, in the present, in the Darkroot Garden, near his grave, available to the chosen undead as an NPC encounter after the main game's Sif battle. She is in mourning, the specific quality of someone who had arrived at a place she had been going to since the moment that person she had come for was dead. Not dramatic grief, not performance of loss, but the specific directed quality of someone who had a thing to do here and was doing it. She was the Lord's Blade Ciaran, the assassin of Gwyn's Four Knights, the one whose specific capability was the precision of elimination, who had served the Age of Fire's need for the kind of action that armies could not perform, and she had loved Artorias. The lore preserves this through her items. The gold and dark silver tracers, her weapons, and the hornet ring she drops when her questline concludes. The hornet ring is found near Artorias' grave in Dark Souls 3. In Dark Souls 3, a small detail that connects her grief to the specific location she associated with what she had lost. She had come to the grave and left something she valued. The ring had stayed. She asked the chosen undead for Artorias' soul. This is the specific request of her questline. She wanted what the chosen undead carried, the soul of Artorias that had been obtained from defeating him. She was not going to use it for power. She was not going to create a weapon from it in the way that the soul transposition system allowed. She wanted it because it was the specific material remnant of the person she had come to mourn. She offered her armor and her weapons in exchange, not as a transaction exactly as the specific gesture of giving what you have to receive what you need, in the understanding that what she was genuine, she was valuable, and that the exchange acknowledged the specific weight of what she was asking for. If the chosen undead gave her the soul, she performed a ritual over Artorias' grave, dancing over the grave with her tracers, the specific weapons she had carried as his peer in Gwyn's service. In what appeared to be a mourning ceremony, the expression of grief through the specific form that the Lord's blade had always used to express everything, her blades. If the chosen undead refused, she became hostile. Not immediately. She offered the choice first, but the refusal to give her the soul of someone she was mourning was met with the specific response of Yama, who had come for something and was not leaving without it. The specific quality of this encounter is the specificity of Ciaran's character. She was not asking for information or assistance or protection. She was asking for the material remnant of someone she had loved. The request was personal, in a way that most Dark Souls NPC requests were not instrumental, not organized around what she could do with it, organized entirely around what it meant to her that it existed and that she could have it. The item she drops when the quest line concludes, a hornet ring, had been hers, associated with her, in the specific way that the ring associated with each of the four knights was associated with them. She left it. She had come to mourn, and she was doing it in the specific way available to her. And the thing she left behind was what she had, Sif, in the main game. She had been in Darkroot Garden since Artorias died. This is the specific duration of her presence at his grave, from the moment of his fall in the chasm of the abyss, through the centuries between the DLC's events and the main game's present, to the encounter the chosen undead has with her in Darkroot Garden, centuries. The wolf, who had been young in the chasm of the abyss, had grown to the enormous form of the Darkroot Garden encounter across years. However many years had passed, she had been guarding the grave through all of it, not because anyone had assigned her to guard it, not because there was an institutional arrangement that maintained the guard, but because this was where Artorias was, and she had not left. The great shield in her mouth, the cleansing great shield, drained its magic defense high from the specific exposure to the abyss that had happened in its final use, was what she carried, not as a weapon she could use, as the specific object that connected her to the person she was guarding the grave of. She had been carrying it since the chasm, since the moment Artorias had lifted it over her to protect her from the humanity sprites. She had kept it. The fight with Sif is one of Dark Souls' most affecting encounters, not because of the specific challenge of the fight, though Sif is a genuinely demanding opponent, but because of the specific moment partway through it when the fight changes, when Sif's health is reduced far enough, when the wolf who has been guarding the grave for centuries has taken enough damage that the fight's end is approaching, she begins to limp. It's a specific animation of a wounded animal who is still fighting, who is going to keep fighting, but who is now doing so, but who is now Sue, with the specific visible evidence of what the fighting is costing her. She recognizes the chosen undead. This is the specific reading of her behavior that the law supports. Not that she simply identified a threat to the grave, but that she had recognized the person who had been in the chasm with her, who had helped in the fight against Manus, who had been there in the past, that she remembered. The sorrowful look that she gives the chosen undead before the fight begins is not simply the look of an animal that does not want to fight. It is the specific sorrow of a wolf who recognizes the person she is about to fight. She fights anyway. The grave is the grave of Artorias. The chosen undead needs access to the area behind it. Sif has been here for centuries, guarding it. What the chosen undead needs requires her to not be here anymore. She fights until she cannot fight. She is protecting what she was left to protect, the specific quality of a being whose loyalty survived centuries without instruction or reward, who kept the shield and guarded the grave, the void, and fought anyone who came for the specific location of the person she had lost, expressed itself in the fight as the specific last effort of someone who had given everything and was giving what remained. What Sif's behavior in the chasm reveals. The optional summon in the Manus fight. Young Sif, available to the chosen undead in the arena, is one of the DLC's most emotionally loaded design choices. She can be summoned after Manus has begun. The summoning occurs in the middle of the fight, not before it, which means that she arrives into the chosen undead's fight, having heard the sounds of the conflict from outside the arena. When she enters the smaller wolf, the young Sif, who had descended into the chasm with Artorias, who had been protected by the barrier he formed. She goes straight to Manus. She knows what she is fighting. She has been here before, not in the sense that the chosen undead has been here before. The DLC's events are happening now, in Sif's present, not in a revisited past for her. Manus is the thing that had taken Artorias. She had been in the chasm with him when the fight happened. She had been inside the barrier when the fight ended. She had not been able to fight because of the barrier. Now there is no barrier. She can fight. The person whose barrier had protected her is gone, consumed, corrupted in the Colosseum. And the thing that had taken him is still here, and there is someone else fighting it. Whether her participation in the Manus fight changes the outcome, whether the chosen undead can defeat Manus more easily with Sif present, the law is less interested in than the specific emotional content of her being there. The wolf who had been protected by the shield came back to fight what the shield had been protecting from. With the person who came after, in the main game, she is enormous, and she carries the shield, and she guards the grave, and she will not let the chosen undead pass without a fight. In the DLC's past, she is smaller, and she goes straight to Manus. She is smallest, and she fights beside the chosen undead because they are fighting something. They are fighting something she was not able to fight before. Both versions of Sif are the same Sif, the same loyalty, the same grief, the same specific quality of a being who does not abandon what she is committed to, whether has committed to, whether the commitment is to fight what took her companion, or to guard where her companion is now. The legend that was built, what the world remembered after Oolacile fell, after the chosen undead returned to the present, after the centuries had passed, and the specific events of the DLC's period had receded into the distance that made them historical rather than immediate. Artorias was remembered as the hero who had saved Dusk, as the knight who had faced the abyss, as the Abysswalker who had prevented the darkness from spreading further. His grave in Darkroot Garden was maintained. The specific location that the game treated as a place of significance, protected by Alvina's forest hunters, guarded by Sif, bearing the cross at its entrance that required the crest of Artorias to open. The truth the legend had omitted. He had not saved Dusk. The chosen undead had saved Dusk. He had not prevented the abyss from spreading. He had been consumed by it, fought in its name in the Colosseum, and had been stopped by the specific intervention that the legend did not name. History remembered the name. It did not have the chosen undead's name to record, the unsung hero who had done what Artorias could not was unsung because the specific mechanism of the time travel had left them outside the history that was being written. They had been there. They had done the things. Nobody in Oolacile's period had understood what the chosen undead was, or why they had appeared, or what their presence meant in the larger story of the Age of Fire's final years. Artorias received the credit, not because of deception, because no one had the information needed to credit the chosen undead. The legend was incomplete by accident rather than by design. This is the specific quality of Dark Souls' relationship to heroism. The hero who is remembered is the hero who was there and failed. The hero who succeeded is the one history could not see. The legend preserves the name that was already known. The actual resolution of the event that the legend was about remained unrecorded. Sleep well. 2 more parts remain, and the legacy of the Abyss extends beyond Oolacile. The story of Artorias and Oolacile did not end with the DLC's resolution. The specific legacy of a knight who had failed at an impossible task, whose failure had been preserved as a legend of success, whose specific dedication to the fight against the Abyss had not ended even when the Abyss had claimed him. This legacy extended forward through the centuries into the time of Dark Souls 3, into the specific figures who had organized their existence around the example of the Abysswalker, the Undead Legion of Ciaran, the Abyss Watchers, warriors who had formed themselves into a legion specifically to Kintis, Continued Spoffalik, to continue the work that Artorias had done, to fight the darkness that spread in the abyss's wake, to take up the torch that the fallen knight had carried, to be what he had been in the world that had developed without him. They drank the blood of the old wolf of Ciaran. This is the specific mechanism of their transformation. The old wolf who inhabited the top of the road of Sacrifice's ruin, whose blood they had consumed to gain the connection to the wolf. That Artorias, his kinship with Sif, had represented. Their consumption of the wolf's blood was the specific act that had made them Lords of Cinder. The specific gathering of power through the ritual that also produced their eventual corruption. Tonight, we follow the Abysswatchers, who they were, what they had built from Artorias' example, and why their fate their fate so closely mirrored the fate of the knight they had tried to honor, the old wolf of Ciaran, the giant wolf that inhabited the ruin at the Road of Sacrifice's highest accessible point, an ancient creature whose specific relationship to the wolf lineage that connected Artorias and Sif was implied rather than stated directly. It was old, the specific quality of extreme age that the old wolf of Ciaran expressed, not active, not a threat, simply present in a way that ancient things sometimes simply are present in the world of dark souls, suggested a being that had been in this specific location for the entire period between the DLC's events and Dark Souls 3's present, centuries. Whether the old wolf was Sif, this is the specific fan theory that the lore architecture supports without confirming the possibility that the enormous grey wolf who had guarded Artorias' grave for centuries and who had eventually been killed by the chosen undead in the main game was somehow preserved, or that the wolf's blood that the Abysswatchers drank was connected to the specific lineage that Sif and Artorias had represented. The lore does not confirm this. The old Wolf of Ciaran's item descriptions note that it served the Undead Legion, that its blood was what gave the Legion their power, that it had been in this location from before the Abysswatchers formed, whether it was Sif or a success to Sif's specific bloodline, or simply an ancient wolf with no direct connection to the Abysswalker's companion. The game provides the parallel and allows the connection without establishing it as fact, what it means practically. The Abysswatchers had built their entire tradition around the specific imagery of a knight and a wolf. The armor they wore echoed Artorias' design, described in the item descriptions as suggesting their own eventual end, wearing the twilight blue that had been the Abysswalker's colour. The weapons they used were great swords in the specific style of Artorias' combat. They had organised their fighting tradition around being what he had been, what the Abysswatchers were, not simply warriors who fought the Abyss, a legion or a formal military organisation with the specific structure of a body of people who had committed to a shared purpose and who maintained that commitment through the specific practices of an institution. They fought any sign of the undead curse spreading. The specific orientation of their combat was not against the abyss as an abstract darkness. It was against the specific spread of the undead condition, the hollowing that the dark soul's world's most visible manifestation of the dark soul going wrong produced in individual humans. They fought wherever the curse was spreading. They tracked it. They addressed it before it could reach the scale that Oolacile had reached. This was Artorias' legacy, not the specific pact with the Abyss's creatures, or the Covenant, or the individual capability that had made him the most qualified person for the Oolacile mission. The specific dedication to fighting the darkness before that it consumed everything. The work of maintaining the vigilance that the Abyss required. The ongoing effort of addressing it wherever it appeared, rather than waiting for it to become a crisis. The Abysswatchers tried to be the continuing expression of this, a permanent institution organized around the specific purpose that Artorias had embodied individually. They became Lords of Cinder. The specific consumption of the old wolf's blood had accumulated in them a power sufficient to link the flame, to perform the ritual sacrifice of self-immolation that the Age of Fire's continuation required. They had gathered enough power to matter at the cosmic level, and then they began to fight each other. The corruption and its mirror, the Abyss Watchers in Dark Souls 3 are found fighting among themselves in the Farron Keep's interior, warriors of the same legion, wearing the same armor, with the same fighting style, attacking each other with the specific ferocity of enemies, rather than the training ground intensity of companions. The Abyss had gotten into one of them. The specific mechanism of Dark Souls 3's presentation of the Abyss Watchers is that the darkness they had been fighting had eventually found its way into the Legion, not as a frontal assault that the warriors had faced and failed against, but as the specific infiltration of something that had gotten inside the body that had been trained to fight it. When one Abyss Watcher was corrupted, the entire Legion's response was to fight it. Not simply the corrupted member, each other, the specific quality of a Legion that had no reliable way to distinguish the corrupted from the uncorrupted expressed itself in the mutual violence of every member turning on every other, because every member was potentially the corruption's host. This is the exact fate that Artorias had suffered, the knight whose specific dedication to fighting the Abyss had taken him to Oolacile, who had fought the darkness until the darkness was inside him and he was fighting on its behalf, had become the thing he had been fighting. The Abyss Watchers, who had organized themselves around his legacy, were repeating his specific end, not through dramatic confrontation with a single overwhelming opponent, through the specific entropy of an institution that had been dedicated to fighting external darkness and had found the darkness internal. They could not fight the abyss that was in one of them without fighting the possibility that it was in all of them. So they fought all of them. They were still fighting when the chosen undead reached Farron Keep. The mutual combat that had been ongoing, how long the law does not specify, but long enough that it had become the defining characteristic of their current state, was interrupted by the player's arrival. The encounter with the Abysswatchers in Dark Souls 3 is designed as a fight against multiple enemies who sometimes attack each other, whose mutual aggression is part of the encounter's mechanics. This is not simply a design choice for variety. It is the specific expression of what the Abyss had done to them. They had become their own worst enemies in the specific way that any institution which cannot distinguish internal corruption from external threat tends to become. What Artorias' greatsword became, the Abyss greatsword, the specific weapon that the soul of Artorias, when soul of Artorias is produced, when transposed in the main game, the blade described as belonging to Lord Gwyn's knight Artorias, who fell to the abyss, swallowed by the dark with its master, tainted by the abyss, and now he, reflecting its wielder's humanity. The weapon that had been Artorias's was tainted by what had consumed him, not simply darkened, specifically altered in its fundamental properties by the contact with the abyss that the knight's fall had produced. It struck harder for beings with high humanity. The specific soul resonance of the Dark Souls material, expressed through a weapon that had been in the abyss with its master. This is the specific form of legacy that a weapon carries in Dark Souls, not simply the associations of its user's history, but the literal alteration of its material properties by what its user had experienced. The Abyss Greatsword was a better weapon for human wielders because Artorias had been consumed by the darkness that was humanity's inheritance. The weaponsmith, Andre in the main game, and later Ludleth in Dark Souls 3 could create weapons from Artorias' soul, the specific object that Ciaran had travelled to Darkroot Garden to retrieve. The soul of Dragardiard, the soul of the knight she had mourned, could be turned into weapons by the chosen undead who had defeated him. This is the specific economy of a Dark Souls item system, and also the specific economy of its lore. The souls of those who fell became resources for those who came after. Whether Ciaran knew this when she asked for the soul eye, whether she was aware that the chosen undead could use it for weapon creation and was asking for its recovery before that happened, the game does not say. She wanted it. She asked for it. The specific reason was grief rather than prevention, but the exchange was organized around the specific object whose material properties, whose reflected everything that had been done to its original holder, the Undead Legion's oath. The specific oath that the Undead Legion had taken, the vow that organized their existence as a body of warriors dedicated to preventing the spread of the darkness, was recorded in the items associated with them. The oath was to bear Artorias' torch, not metaphorically, the specific fire that the Abysswalker had carried, the light against the darkness that his dedication represented, was what they had committed to carrying forward. They were not simply his successors in function. They were his successors in meaning, the specific continuation of what he had been trying to do in the job, in the specific form of an institution that could persist past the limits of individual capability. Their armor suggests their own eventual end. This is the specific phrase from the Dark Souls 3 item description. The twilight blue tassel damp will ever remain so. The armor designed to echo Artorias's was designed with the knowledge of what had happened to Artorias. The suggestion of the eventual end that was built into the design was not pessimism, it was accuracy. The Abyss Watchers who wore the armor of the Abysswalker were wearing of fighting the knowledge of what Abyss eventually did to the people who fought it. They became what they fought anyway, because the specific work of fighting the Abyss, going into the darkness, pursuing it wherever it spread, maintaining the specific proximity to what corrupted, that sustained contact with it required, produced the specific consequence that Elizabeth had identified when she looked at Artorias and said he had nary a murmur of dark. Without doubt he would be swallowed. You cannot fight the darkness without being near it. You now cannot be near it without it finding the specific way into you that it finds. The people who dedicate themselves to stopping it are the people who end up closest to it. The Abyss Watchers wore armor that acknowledged this. They fought anyway. The continuing spread. Dark Souls 3 made explicit what the earlier games had implied. The Abyss was still spreading. The specific work that Artorias had done at Oolacile, that the chosen Undead had completed by defeating Manus, that the Abyss Watchers had extended into an ongoing institutional practice at best, had not eliminated the Abyss. The Abyss could not be eliminated. It was the Dark Souls expression, the human inheritance, the specific quality of what humanity was carrying that could overflow into the surrounding world. Under the right conditions, it could be fought. It could be fought. The spread could be slowed. Individual expressions of it could be addressed, but the fundamental resource from which it drew, the Dark Soul distributed into every human, was not removable from the world without removing humanity from the world. This is what Hawkeye Goff had acknowledged when he said to the chosen Undead, even if this land shall expire, thou may be able to prevent further corrosion. But even so, one day the flames will fade and only dark will remain. And even a legend such as thine self can do nothing to stop that. Even Goff knew, the knight who had served Gwyn for the entire Age of Fire, who had been positioned at his tower in Oolacile, to serve whatever function a giant archer could serve in the crisis. These knew that the specific work the chosen undead was doing was temporary, that one day the flames would fade, that the dark was not something that could be permanently prevented, only delayed. Artorias had delayed it. The chosen undead had delayed it. The Abysswatchers had tried to delay it and had been consumed by it. Dark Souls 3's entire structure was organized around the specific end of the delay, the time when the flames were fading, when the dark was returning, when the specific work that generations of heroes had done was reaching its natural conclusion. The Abysswalker's torch had been carried forward by Sif for centuries in Darkroot Garden, by the Abysswatchers in their failing institution, by the item descriptions that preserved his name and his deed across every iteration of the Dark Souls narrated stories. Across every illustration of the Dark Souls narrative, the torch would eventually go out. Everyone who had carried it had known this. They had carried it anyway. Sleep well. One final part remains, and the story still has something left to say. Let everything slow. We have followed Artorias from the Four Knights of Gwyn through the Covenant of the Abyss and the fight against the dark wraiths of New Londo, through the Oolacile mission and the theft of the Silver Pendant, and the battle in the chasm of the Abyss and the barrier around Sif. We have followed the legend that was built from his failure and Sif's vigil at the grave. We have followed Ciaran's mourning and the Abysswatcher's attempt to continue what he had been. Now we step back and we ask what the story was doing, the structure of the tragedy. Artorias' story is organized around a specific pattern that Dark Souls uses for its most affecting characters. The noble failure, not the failure of incompetence, not the failure of moral compromise, not the failure of someone who made choices they should have known were wrong. The failure of someone who had done everything right and was defeated anyway by the specific combination of circumstances that the best preparation and the best character could not prevent. He was the most qualified person for the Oolacile mission. He had the Covenant, the Silver Pendant, the skill, the companion. He had fought the Abyss before. He was not overconfident. Elizabeth's warning suggested that someone with his specific qualities was going to fail regardless, and the game implies that Artorias understood the risk he was taking. He went anyway. This is the specific detail that the story preserves alongside the failure. He went knowing the odds were against him. He went because the specific work required someone, and he was the one most qualified to do it. And the fact that the odds were against him did not constitute a reason not to try. He protected Sif in the specific moment when his defeat was certain, when the Abyss had broken his arm and Manus had him. His last uncorrupted act was not an attempt to survive or to continue fighting or to escape. It was the barrier, the drained great shield, the wolf protected at the cost of everything else. He asked to be stopped, the words before the Colosseum fight. "Forgive me, for I have availed you nothing," were not the words of someone asking to be saved or mourned. They were the specific words of someone who understood that what he had become was a problem, and that the appropriate response to the problem was to stop it. He was not simply a fallen hero. He was a fallen hero who, in his final moments of awareness, was asking the unsung hero to do what needed to be done. This is the specific quality of Artorias' tragedy that makes it more than simply sad. He was not defeated and forgotten. He was defeated and remembered, but remembered as something he was not, in a legend that preserved his name while attributing to him the deeds of the person who came after. His actual story, the barrier, the words, the specific request, was not what the legend recorded. What Sif's vigil means, Sif had been in Darkroot Garden for centuries, not because she was assigned to guard the grave, because she chose to be there. The specific quality of her presence at the grave was the most direct documentation in the Dark Souls world of what genuine loyalty looked like in practice rather than in principle. She was not performing loyalty. She was expressing it through the specific, ongoing act of being present at the place that mattered, carrying the object that connected her to the person she had lost, fighting anyone who came for the space she was maintaining. The fight with Sif in the main game is constructed to make the player feel the specific weight of what they are doing, not simply a difficult boss, a boss whose specific behavior, whose recognition of the chosen undead, whose limping in the fight's final stages was designed to produce the specific grief of someone who understood what the fight required and did not want to do it. The game requires it. The covenant of Artorias' ring, which Sif drops when defeated, is needed for the chosen undead to access certain areas. The specific mechanism of the main game's progression is organized such that getting past Sif is necessary. The game does not provide an alternative route. It does not offer a way to convince Sif to stand aside. It puts the player in the position of having to defeat the wolf who had been guarding the grave for centuries, who recognized them from the chasm, who had been doing the specific work of loyalty for longer than most civilizations had lasted. And it makes you feel it. The limp, the sorrowful look at the beginning, the specific sound design of the encounter. These were not incidental. They were the game's specific tool for producing the emotional experience that the lore required. This is what Dark Souls does at its best. It creates situations where the player understands what they are doing and does it anyway, because the game's structure requires it, and the experience of understanding and doing produces something that passive observation of a cutscene cannot. The legend's incompleteness. History remembered Artorias as the hero who faced the abyss, the chosen undead who actually saved Dusk and defeated Manus, was unsung, not recorded in the histories that the Age of Fire eventually produced, not named in the traditions that the Abysswatchers maintained. This is Dark Souls' most specific statement about heroism. The named heroes are not always the ones who did the defining thing. The records we have are the records of what was recorded, not the records of what happened. The people who made the most important interventions in the world's events were sometimes the people that the history had no mechanism to record, who arrived through circumstances that the recording systems could not categorize, who acted in the specific space between what happened and what was written down about what happened. The chosen undead in Oolacile had done the things that made the legend of Artorias possible. They had saved Dusk. They had defeated Manus. They had fought beside young Sif in the chasm. They had ended Artorias' suffering in the Colosseum and preserved his honor. None of this was recorded under their name. The records showed Artorias as the hero because the records had been built around what Artorias was known to have been doing. Going to Oolacile, fighting the abyss, trying to rescue the princess. The unsung hero who had actually completed the mission existed in the gap between the historical record and what had happened. This gap is not presented as an injustice exactly. The game is not arguing that the chosen undead was cheated of recognition or that history was wrong to remember Artorias. It is simply observing that the record and the event are not the same thing. That the hero the world remembers is not necessarily the hero who did the most consequential thing, and that the most consequential things are sometimes done by people who were not supposed to be there at all. What it means to bear the torch. The Abysswatchers built their entire tradition around bearing the torch of the Abysswalker. They did it while wearing armor that described their own eventual end. They did it knowing that the darkness they were fighting was not something that could be permanently prevented, only delayed. This is the specific condition of all the heroism that Dark Souls documents, not the heroism of victories that resolve the conflict, the heroism of people who understand that the conflict cannot be permanently resolved and who choose to address it anyway for the specific duration available to them with the specific tools they have. Artorias had understood this. His willingness to go to Oolacile, despite the specific odds against him, despite Elizabeth's knowing that he would fail, was not naivety or overconfidence. It was the specific choice of someone who understood that the duration was what was available to him, and that doing the thing that needed that duration was what the work required. He was consumed by what he was fighting. He asked to be stopped when it was too late for him to stop it himself. He protected the wolf in his last uncorrupted moment. These are the specific things he did, not the legend, not the hero who repelled the abyss, the knight who went when the odds were against him, who did the best he could, who used his last capable act to protect someone smaller than him, who asked for mercy in the specific form of being ended rather than continuing as something that had consumed him. This is what the torch of the Abysswalker actually was, not triumph. The specific commitment to showing up for the work even knowing it would eventually be too much. The specific quality of someone who did not let the knowledge of the eventual failure prevent the immediate effort. The Abysswatchers had known what they were signing up for. They had drunk the blood and worn the armor that suggested their own eventual end and gone to find the darkness wherever it spread. They had ended as Artorias had ended, consumed by what they fought, destroying each other in the confusion of corruption, becoming the specific problem they had been built to address. They had borne the torch until they could not. One final image, Darkroot Garden, the green space that had grown over Oolacile's ruins, the forest that the main game had always occupied by, but that the DLC had shown had been a battlefield. The Oolacile sanctuary, now covered in centuries of growth, the specific geography of a place that had been the site of a catastrophe and had been growing over it ever since. The grave marker, a great shield leaning against stones at the grave of Artorias the Abysswalker. Sif's position in front of it, the hornet ring on the ground nearby. Ciaran's grief left behind as an object, the specific remnant of a mourning that had happened here and been expressed through the things she had left. The forest is quiet, the specific quality of Darkroot Garden's environmental design. The muted colours, the soft light, the specific sense of a place that has been left alone long enough to develop its own character. is the character of somewhere that has had time to process what it contained. Artorias is here, not as a boss, not as a figure the player encounters directly in the main game's present, as the specific presence that the grave and the marker and the great shield and Sif and Ciaran's ring document. He is here in the way that people are present in the places they left marks. The legend says he saved the princess and repelled the abyss. The truth is that he fought and lost and asked to be stopped and protected his wolf in his last moment. The legend and the truth both point to the same person. They just describe different aspects of the same story. He was a great knight. He fell. His legacy survived him and was carried forward by those who loved what he represented. The darkness that had taken him continued to spread. The people who fought it continued to be consumed by it. And in Darkroot Garden, a grey wolf had been guarding a grave since before the chosen Undead was born, carrying a drained great shield, waiting. This has been the entire Dark Souls. Artorias and the Abyss timeline, from the Four Knights of Gwyn and the covenant that allowed him to walk in darkness, through the theft of the Silver Pendant and the battle in the chasm, through the corrupted knight in the Colosseum and the young wolf summoned to fight what had taken him, through Sif's centuries and Ciaran's mourning, and the Abyss Watchers who bore the torch until they were consumed, told slowly over 8 nights. For the quiet space between waking and the dark, the torch had been carried for as long as it could be. Good night.